I used to think I understood what silence truly felt like, the kind of quiet comfort that settles over a house after a long day, when the dishwasher hums its familiar, rhythmic tune and the evening news plays at a low, comforting murmur on the television. But that wasn't silence. I didn't know what real silence was until my husband James passed away, leaving me to learn that true quiet isn't just an absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating nothingness that aggressively filled every single inch of the space we had once shared. It wasn't just a quiet house. It was a relentless void that followed me from room to room, a psychological pressure so thick it made the ticking of the clock sound completely deafening, and the slow drip of the kitchen faucet feel like a sharp physical strike against my nerves. We had been married for 37 long years, building an entire universe together. And then, without any grand farewells or sudden warnings, he simply died in his sleep right beside me. A sudden heart attack took him in the dark, and I woke up to a profound, unshakable stillness in the bed that has clung to my bones every second since that terrifying morning. In the immediate, hazy days that followed his passing, the house was suddenly full of people who came to offer their soft voices and pitying eyes. But eventually, as the world kept turning, they all left to return to their own untouched lives. They left behind a refrigerator, completely packed with heavy casseroles I had no appetite to eat, while countless sympathy cards piled up into towering stacks across the dining room table. I became a ghost in my own home, a 61-year-old widow named Sarah, merely going through the agonizing motions of daily survival. I forced myself to smile when it was expected, nodded politely at the hollow condolences, and said the words, "Thank you entirely too many times to count." The true depth of my detachment finally hit me one ordinary morning when I found myself standing motionless in the middle of the hallway, a dry toothbrush gripped tightly in my hand, struck by the sudden, horrifying realization that I hadn't actually brushed my teeth in 3 entire days. The tears that finally broke free and streamed down my face weren't about the neglected toothbrush. I wept uncontrollably because I had completely forgotten how to function, how to exist, how to simply be a person anymore. Exactly 2 days after we buried him, my son Liam showed up at the front door. He told me he was just going to stay for a little while, stepping inside to help shield me from the crushing isolation. He walked into the foyer carrying his heavy duffel bag, his laptop, and an old familiar denim jacket from his high school days, the exact same one that still bore a distinct ragged rip right under the right arm. When he stepped close, the fabric carried a scent that was intensely, uniquely him. A lingering, complex mix of his favorite cologne, the faint trace of leftover cigarette smoke, and a deeper, richer, warmer scent that I couldn't quite put a specific name to. At first, having him back in his childhood home was nothing short of a profound blessing. He brought necessary noise back into the suffocating house, a real, tangible, living noise that chased away the shadows. The mornings were suddenly marked by the comforting sound of fresh coffee brewing, the casual clatter of kitchen cabinet doors being left open, and the sharp, steady clacks of his keyboard echoing from where he worked at the dining table. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he made me laugh again. Sometimes, late at night when the house grew too quiet, we would sit side by side on the living room couch, finding solace in watching old, familiar crime shows on the television. His arm would naturally and comfortably settle around my tired shoulders as the hours passed. I would lean into his solid warmth entirely, without thinking, falling into the exact same comforting posture I used to take back when he was a little boy and found himself scared of loud thunderstorms. Then, 2 weeks into his stay, a violent storm actually came, and the power abruptly went out across the neighborhood. Heavy rain slammed relentlessly against the living room windows, as we moved through the dark to light flickering candles throughout the room, needing something to cut the tension of the blackout. I searched the pantry and found a dusty, old bottle of red wine, uncorking it so we could pour a generous glass for each of us. As we sat in the dim golden light, we didn't talk much at all. At first, we simply sat there together, letting the heavy, rhythmic sound of the pouring rain fill in all the vast, empty spaces that hovered between us. Breaking the long silence, he looked at the shadows dancing on the walls, and mentioned that it felt strange being back in this house. But he quickly clarified that it wasn't a bad feeling. I nodded in quiet agreement, admitting softly that it was incredibly nice not to be entirely alone anymore, and he looked over at me with an expression that was remarkably soft and intensely steady. "You are not alone, Mom," he told me with absolute conviction. "I am here." And in that exact fraction of a second, something deep and foundational inside of me irreversibly shifted. It wasn't some grand, dramatic, cinematic thing. There was no swelling music playing in the background to signal a change in the narrative. But I remember that specific, quiet moment so vividly, locking onto exactly how he looked at me. Like I was entirely more than just his mother. Like I was a complex, living woman. I remember exactly how my grieving heart unexpectedly skipped a desperate beat, and how I immediately frantically tried to blame the sudden flutter on the red wine, the overwhelming grief, and the chaotic storm raging outside. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I knew with terrifying certainty that something fundamental had changed between us. Just before he finally got up to blow out the flickering candles for the night, he paused closely behind the back of the couch. His warm hand deliberately brushed against my tense shoulder. He gave it a gentle, grounding squeeze, and then he leaned in close in the dark, pressing his firm forehead directly to mine for just a fleeting second. He didn't say a single word as he pulled away, but in that heavy, charged silence, I heard absolutely everything. The entire next morning, I desperately tried to rationalize the encounter, telling myself repeatedly that it was absolutely nothing but the remnants of the storm. I tried to convince myself it was just the heavy wine, just the twisted manifestations of grief playing cruel psychological tricks on two shattered people who had simply been through far too much trauma. But all of those logical excuses utterly failed to explain the intense, focused way Liam looked at me over the kitchen table during breakfast. Or more importantly, it didn't explain the lingering, charged way I looked right back at him. He was standing casually by the kitchen window, pouring steaming coffee into mugs, while the early morning light softly illuminated his white t-shirt, his slightly damp hair from the shower, and that exact same sleepy, mischievous grin he used to flash back when he was 10 years old and caught sneaking a sugary Pop-Tart. "Want a cup?" he asked smoothly, breaking my stare. I nodded quietly, offering a soft please. As he stepped closer and handed me the warm ceramic mug, his bare fingers deliberately brushed against mine, and crucially, neither of us pulled away right away. As our skin maintained contact, something undeniable fluttered wildly in my chest. And surprisingly, it wasn't a feeling of panic. It was just a sharp electric awareness of his physical presence. Seeking a distraction from the heavy air, we spent that entire day tackling the daunting task of cleaning out the dusty attic, a space I hadn't dared to venture up into since James passed. "Come on," Liam had said to me gently but firmly, insisting that it is time to face the memories, and deep down I knew he wasn't wrong. The sprawling attic was dim and choked with dust-packed wall to wall with heavy cardboard boxes, meticulously labeled in James's distinct familiar handwriting, holding forgotten relics like his old golf clubs and faded letters saved from his college years. There was even an old acoustic guitar tucked in the corner that he hadn't bothered to play in over a decade. We sat comfortably cross-legged on the rough wooden floorboards, carefully sorting through decades of accumulated years and forgotten milestones. At the bottom of one box, I found an old, faded photograph of James proudly holding a tiny baby Liam during a family trip to the beach. The crashing ocean waves were perfectly captured in the background, the bright summer sun illuminating the light in their hair. And as I stared at the frozen moment, a genuine smile crossed my face entirely without me meaning to. Liam gently took the fragile photo from my hands, studied it quietly for a long moment, and then looked directly at me. "You are a good mom," he stated softly. "Still are." When I looked over at him right then, the illusion of the little boy from the beach vanished completely. I didn't see him as my son, but fully as a grown 30-year-old man. I noticed how he was so much broader in the shoulders now, and how his eyes held vastly more emotional depth and worldliness than they used to. There was a quiet, unshakable physical and emotional strength radiating from him that I somehow simply hadn't noticed until this exact charged moment. Reaching across the space between us, he confidently took my hand and held it firmly in his own. His grip was incredibly warm and perfectly gentle. "We're going to be okay," he promised softly in the quiet of the attic. And for the absolute first time since the agonizing day of the funeral, I truly, deeply believed his words. That night, alone in my bedroom, sleep completely evaded me. I lay rigidly in my large, empty bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling fan, while its soft, rhythmic whir barely managed to fill the oppressive silence of the room. My anxious mind ran endless, exhausting laps, violently questioning everything I was feeling. What was considered normal in grief? What was expected of a widow? What would the outside world say if they knew how my heart was racing? But eventually, those frantic thoughts were entirely overpowered as I thought deeply about the sensation of being physically held. I thought about the profound intimacy of truly being seen by another person. I realized that for weeks now, Liam had been the absolute only person to look at me like I was actually still here, like my existence still mattered. He looked at me like I was still genuinely alive, and in doing so, he had slowly become a vital, guiding kind of light in the middle of all this suffocating grief. The very next day, driven by a need for physical exhaustion, we stepped outside into the hot sun to tackle organizing the cluttered shed out back. The summer air outside smelled heavily of fresh pine needles and rich, dark dirt. Despite the heavy labor, we found ourselves laughing far more than we actually worked. At one chaotic point, I carelessly tripped right over a loose wooden plank on the floor, stumbling forward. But Liam immediately lunged and caught me, his strong arms wrapping tightly and securely around my waist, holding me perfectly steady against his chest. Breathless, I looked slowly up into his face. He didn't make a single move to step back or release his grip. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and vibrating against me. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. But the truth was, I wasn't okay. Not really. Something fundamental and fragile had just cracked completely wide open inside my chest. Sensing the overwhelming shift in the air, he finally stepped back slowly, nervously clearing his throat in the sudden distance. "Let's take a break," he suggested quietly, and I just nodded quickly, desperately pretending not to notice the violent way my own hands trembled uncontrollably as I retreated to the kitchen to pour cold lemonade into 2 tall wine glasses. When I returned, I couldn't stop watching him covertly from the very corner of my eye. I fixated on the elegant, confident way he held the delicate glass in his hand, and the smooth, deliberate way he leaned his body forward to light the last remaining candle in the room. I was mesmerized by the intense, searching way he looked at me, looking at me as if I was a fascinating stranger, someone deeply worth knowing all over again from the very beginning. He didn't speak a single word to break the tension. He simply didn't need to. He just reached out across the space with agonizing slowness and gently tucked a loose stray strand of hair behind my ear. His warm fingertips barely brushed against the sensitive skin of my cheek, but the electric jolt of that agonizingly brief touch stayed burning within me long after I finally retreated and went to bed. That night, suspended in a state of exhaustion and awakening, I dreamed of absolutely nothing and absolutely everything all at once. There were no distinct vivid scenes playing out in my mind, just overwhelming, consuming feelings. I dreamed of intense warmth of familiar, comforting skin pressed against mine, and of a strong, undeniable presence that definitely wasn't James's, but shockingly, it didn't feel wrong in the slightest. When I finally woke up the next morning, the crushing atmosphere of the house felt miraculously lighter. It felt as though some massive, invisible weight had finally shifted and settled. It felt like maybe I had shifted too. I walked downstairs to find Liam already awake and moving around, completely barefoot in the sunlit kitchen, casually frying eggs on the stove. Hearing me enter, he looked up from the pan, smiled that bright, familiar smile, like he always had, and smoothly said, "Morning, beautiful." Those two simple words landed entirely differently than they ever had before. They were vastly softer than what should be normal. The tone was entirely too soft to be meant for a mother, and far too rich and warm to just be considered polite morning chatter. Completely flustered by the compliment, I chuckled nervously and deflected, telling him, "You are too much." But despite my verbal retreat, something deep and dormant inside of my soul instantly glowed with warmth. We carefully avoided talking about the intense events of the night before. We didn't mention the charged moment in the shed, nor did we speak of the wine we shared. We utterly avoided discussing the breathtaking way his hand had lingered so deliberately on my cheek, resting there like he felt he had every natural right in the world to touch me. Instead of confronting it, we quietly ate our breakfast together, moved on to mindlessly folding a basket of laundry, and later that cool afternoon, we decided to leave the house to take a long walk outside. The dirt trail we chose was incredibly quiet, leaving just the two of us surrounded by the crisp, satisfying sound of dry leaves crunching beneath our heavy shoes. Our path eventually led us to cross over a small weathered wooden bridge, the exact same bridge that James and I had casually walked across 100 different times during our marriage. But this time, as we stepped onto the planks, Liam reached out and firmly took my hand. There were no words exchanged to justify the action. There were just his strong fingers seamlessly lacing tightly together with mine, acting like holding my hand was simply second nature to him. I didn't make any move to stop him. The truth was, I didn't want to stop him at all. "You okay?" He checked in softly, his rough thumb gently brushing back and forth across the sensitive skin on the back of my hand. "Getting there," I answered honestly, and for the first time in an eternity, I truly meant the words I spoke. We ended up standing on that old wooden bridge for much longer than we actually needed to, leaning against the railing just silently watching the steady stream of water flow below us, while his broad shoulder remained warmly pressed touching mine. I fully leaned my weight into his side, soaking in the contact. And for the first time in agonizing months of grief, I finally didn't feel like a hollow, transparent ghost trapped inside my own skin. That evening, seeking comfort, we settled onto the couch to watch a movie together. He deliberately sat very close to me, noticeably closer than he usually did, and at some quiet point during the film, his hand moved and came to rest incredibly lightly on my bare knee. The gesture wasn't aggressive or possessive, nor was it meant to be dramatic. It was just a steady, intentional presence. The contact sent a quiet, radiating warmth that instantly lit up something dark and deep inside of my core. I remained completely still, refusing to move. I didn't stay still out of fear or confusion, but simply because I didn't want to escape his touch. I finally allowed myself full permission to just sit there and genuinely feel the electric connection. The following day, drawn back to the past, we returned upstairs to clean out even more of the massive attic. This process had quickly transformed into our own new, sacred ritual, a daily routine built entirely on sorting through dusty boxes, forgotten memories, thick layers of dust, and old, untold stories. The heavy veil of mourning had lifted enough that we actually laughed much more frequently now. We found ourselves eagerly talking about random, trivial things we simply had never bothered to discuss with each other before. While blindly digging my hands through a large plastic old Christmas bin, I pulled out a heavy forgotten photo album. Flipping through the thick pages, I found pictures documenting a long Ago road trip out to the Grand Canyon. Liam had only been 12 years old at the time, and James had stubbornly driven the car the entire exhausting way there. Tucked in the sleeve was a candid photo of a young Liam, fast asleep in the back seat of the car, fiercely clutching a colorful bag of gummy bears to his chest, like it was absolute treasure. When I showed it to him, he let out a loud laugh as he saw his younger self. "I can't believe you kept that," he said, shaking his head in amusement. I smiled up at him softly. "I kept everything," I admitted honestly. "You are my only child, every little moment mattered." He didn't offer a quick, joking reply right away. He just stood there, looking intensely at me with something incredibly heavy and serious shifting in his eyes. "I know you've always been there," he finally said, his voice dropping softly. "For every scraped knee, every heartbreak, you never let go." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly tight with emotion. "You were worth holding on to," I whispered back to him. Moving deliberately, he reached out and took my hand into his once again, his touch gentle but carrying absolutely no hesitation. His dark, focused gaze lingered intensely on my face, the eye contact feeling unbearably deep and entirely deliberate. And for a very long, suspended stretch of time, neither of us felt the need to say a single word. We just sat there together in the very middle of 100 scattered, dusty memories, our hands tightly intertwined together, just like it had always been secretly meant to be that way from the very start. Later that night, the heavy atmosphere turned light again as we stood side by side to make dinner together, cooking a simple meal of boiling pasta, buttery garlic bread, and pouring generous glasses of cheap red wine to share. Lost in the rhythm of the evening, we ended up dancing wildly in the middle of the kitchen, swaying and spinning to the crackling sounds of an old Sam Cooke record we had unearthed from the back of the closet. We danced terribly, stumbling over our own feet, but we moved so joyfully. The pure elation peaked when I accidentally tripped hard over the edge of the kitchen rug and completely fell forward directly into his solid chest, causing us both to collapse toward the floor in fits of breathless laughter. As we lay there tangled together on the hard, cool tile of the floor, still trying to catch our breath, his strong arms remained securely wrapped around my body. The laughter slowly faded into a charged silence as he looked down at me. "You have the most beautiful smile," he whispered against my skin. I didn't utter a word in answer. I didn't need to. I just kept my eyes locked on his, looking up at him as we lay on the floor, and slowly I allowed my wide, laughing smile to gently fade into something infinitely softer and more vulnerable. It was an expression that wasn't exactly quite a verbal confession of my shifting feelings, but it absolutely wasn't a denial of the burning tension between us either. When I retreated upstairs that night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror for much longer than usual. I stared hard at my own reflection, searching my features. Staring back at me, I didn't see the grieving, shattered widow anymore. I didn't see the exhausted maternal mother. I just saw myself, just me, a woman entirely reborn in the wake of tragedy. The deep, tired lines etched around my eyes hadn't miraculously vanished, but there was a vibrant, undeniable flush of color blooming in my pale cheeks. Once again, there was a distinct, remarkable softness in my overall expression that I hadn't witnessed in my own face in so many grueling months. Simply put, I looked vibrantly alive standing there in the quiet upstairs. I could faintly hear the downstairs lights systematically being switched off for the night. I listened to the steady, gentle, comforting rhythm of Liam walking through the house, securely locking the front door. I heard the familiar, sharp creak of the hallway floorboard, everyday sounds that only weeks ago would have utterly crushed me by reminding me of James's agonizing loss. But tonight, they felt like a warm, undeniable presence wrapping around me. They felt profoundly like belonging. When I finally retreated to the bedroom and slipped beneath the cool, heavy covers of the bed, I found myself once again staring up at the turning ceiling fan above me. But this time my mind was mercifully clear. I wasn't being mercilessly haunted by dark, spiraling thoughts. I felt incredibly deeply grounded in the present moment. I wasn't feeling torn about what was happening, nor was I feeling ashamed of the racing in my heart. I was just sitting in a state of intense, hyper-focused awareness. The dawn of the next morning brought a thick, gray fog rolling over the property. It was the specific kind of heavy, obscuring fog that visually softened the edges of the whole backyard, turning the landscape into something out of a blurry, ethereal dream. I stood quietly at the glass of the kitchen window, a steaming cup of coffee clutched tightly in my hand, simply watching the condensation and dew slowly slide off the slick wooden porch railing. In the quiet house, I clearly heard him moving before I actually saw him. I tracked the familiar sound of Liam's heavy footsteps walking upstairs, feeling the unique grounding weight of his specific movements through the ceiling. He eventually came padding down the wooden stairs, a white towel casually draped around the back of his neck, his dark hair still dripping damp from the hot shower. Stepping right up to me, he confidently kissed my cheek, exactly like it was an established, unbreakable habit. Now, like greeting me with a kiss, was just how things had always been between us. "Morning beautiful," he murmured against my skin, repeating the words again with absolute ease. It was an action that by all logical rights should have felt jarring and incredibly strange. But it didn't feel strange at all. We spent that entire foggy day engaged in our new routine of sorting through yet more of the stacked attic boxes. Though the truth was, it wasn't really about actually organizing the clutter anymore. Digging through the artifacts of the past had subtly evolved. It had become our unique, shared way of actively remembering the life that was, but doing it together as a team. We were intentionally touching the painful, beautiful past so that we could consciously make emotional room for whatever this entirely new, unnamed present was rapidly becoming between us. Late in the quiet hours of the afternoon, while emptying pockets, I stumbled across a small folded note tucked safely inside one of James's old, forgotten jackets. Smoothing out the paper, I saw it was just a mundane grocery list written entirely in my own handwriting, but with a small, affectionate heart cheerfully doodled in the bottom corner. Feeling a bittersweet pang, I carried it over and showed the scrap of paper to Liam. He looked down at the heart, smiled softly at the memory of our family, and then reached out, taking my hand in his and pressing my palm firmly and directly flat against his own beating chest. "You've always loved hard," he told me, his voice rough with emotion, "even in the small ways." When the evening finally rolled around, we naturally gravitated to sit close together by the crackling fire once again. We sat with two separate books open on our laps, but our legs were completely tucked under one large shared blanket. We existed in a state of perfectly shared, intimate silence. It was the rare kind of profound stillness that actively holds heavy emotional weight in the air. It offered me absolute comfort and an undeniable sense of meaning. Without breaking his gaze from his book, he blindly reached over for my hand, hidden safely beneath the fabric of the blanket, and he gripped it securely, holding on to me like he wasn't politely asking for permission. He held it exactly like we both already inherently knew that this contact was inevitable. His thumb immediately began moving in lazy, agonizingly slow circles, tracing across the sensitive skin of my hand. That single, incredibly small, deeply tender physical motion caused something massive and hungry to violently stir deep inside the pit of my stomach. Shifting his body, he finally turned and looked directly at me. Not looking past me into the distance, and absolutely not looking through me like a ghost, but looking piercingly and deeply right into me. His intense gaze made me feel like I wasn't just a familiar woman he had known his entire life, but rather someone entirely new, a captivating stranger "You've always been beautiful," he stated quietly into the firelight. There was absolutely no playful flirtation in his deep voice, just the raw delivery of absolute truth. Hearing the words, my frantic heart violently stuttered in my chest. I couldn't find the breath, so I didn't verbally respond. I didn't need to try to form words. I just let the heavy weight of his declaration settle exactly where the words landed in the room. That night, when I finally retreated upstairs and got ready for bed, I purposefully didn't rush through the motions. I stood in the bathroom and took the time to brush out my long hair with meticulous care. I bypassed my usual sleepwear and intentionally put on a delicate, incredibly soft robe that I had completely ignored and hadn't worn in several long months. Catching my own reflection in the glass mirror once again, I paused, and for the absolute first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't immediately turn away from my own body in shame or sorrow. Much later, after the house had gone completely dark, I heard the faint sound of Liam standing quietly right outside my locked bedroom door. He knocked just once against the wood. The sound was remarkably soft. "Didn't want you to be alone," he announced softly, through the barrier of the closed door outside the window. A massive storm was aggressively rolling in, bringing the threatening sound of low thunder echoing ominously in the dark distance. Reaching down, I slowly pulled back the heavy edge of the bed blanket. "Come in," I called out, giving him permission. The door opened, and without a word, he climbed directly into the bed and settled beside me, moving exactly like he used to do back when he was only 5 years old and was terrified of the loud thunder. But as his body heat radiated against mine, I knew that this time it absolutely wasn't childhood fear that brought us pressed together in the dark. It was something entirely else, something intense and fiercely unnamed, but it felt absolutely no less real than fear. He wrapped his arms around me and held me securely as the aggressive thunder rolled violently across the black sky. And when the bright morning sun finally came streaming through the blinds, we were still deeply and tightly wrapped around each other's bodies. We were laying perfectly still, our chests rising and falling, breathing in total, rhythmic sync with one another. When we finally woke up, we didn't speak a single word about what had shifted in the night. We absolutely didn't need to discuss it. The long, lazy days that followed that storm moved incredibly gently. We didn't share any massive, dramatic, cinematic moments of confession. There were no harsh boundaries or clear lines drawn in the sand to define us. Our days were just built on soft, quiet, intimate routines that managed to fill the entire empty house with warmth, much like bright sunlight filtering gently through thin, sheer curtains. Without being asked, Liam officially took over the kitchen and started happily making breakfast for the two of us every single morning. He would stand at the hot stove and absent-mindedly hum something melodic, while rapidly whisking the eggs, standing completely barefoot with his dark hair still dripping damp from his morning shower. When the food was ready, he would walk over, hand me my warm plate with a brilliant wide smile, and press a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the top of my hand. He never offered any grand words with the gesture. It was always just a simple, physical gesture, but the tender action communicated absolutely everything I ever needed to hear. We actively avoided speaking in loud, dramatic declarations about our changing dynamic. We never felt the pressure because we completely didn't need to label it. Whatever this profound connection between us was, it absolutely didn't ask or demand for a formal name. It simply existed in the space between us. It remained incredibly soft and undeniably steady. It felt as natural and essential as drawing breath. One quiet Sunday afternoon, we found ourselves standing side by side in the narrow hallway, silently staring up at the gallery wall of old framed family photos. We looked at James's frozen, smiling face, captured in time. We stared at the framed portrait of baby Liam, wearing tiny overalls, his small cheeks looking incredibly round and absolutely full of vibrant life. Right in the center hung a slightly faded picture of the three of us posing together at a local pumpkin patch, showing me with messy pieces of hay tangled in my hair, captured laughing wildly, like I was completely unaware that the camera was even watching me. As we stared at the ghosts of our past, Liam's warm hand slowly reached out and confidently found the exact curve of the small of my back. Resting his palm there heavily, staring at the photos, the anxiety crept in. "Do you ever think about what people would say?" I quietly asked him, breaking the silence. He remained completely quiet, absorbing the weight of the question for a very long, suspended moment. "Sometimes," he finally admitted, his voice rough. Then, turning his head, he looked directly at me, his intense eyes holding mine completely steady without flinching. "But they don't know what it is like to totally lose someone, to physically feel absolutely everything fall completely out from under you," he stated passionately. "And then, against all odds, to miraculously find someone who actively makes you want to find the strength to stand up again." Moving his body fully toward me in the narrow hallway, he reached out with both hands and tenderly took my face between his palms, holding me gently but firmly. "You bring me back to life," he confessed, the raw words hanging between us. I honestly don't know exactly how long we stood frozen there in the hallway. His warm forehead was pressed gently and intimately against mine. Our breathing remained perfectly slow, completely matching each other's rhythm. I knew that absolutely no one else in the entire world would have ever understood the profound, undeniable truth of that specific moment. But the truth was, that moment wasn't meant for anyone else to judge or understand. Later that exact same night, I was violently jolted awake by the sudden crack of thunder, booming outside once again. The storm started off relatively soft at first, but quickly grew much louder and more aggressive. But this time, lying in the dark room, the chaotic noise didn't rattle my nerves or induce panic at all, because when I instinctually reached my hand out across the mattress, I didn't find cold, terrifying emptiness waiting for me. I instantly found him. I found Liam laying exactly there, his strong, heavy arm wrapped securely around my bare waist, his hot, rhythmic breath ghosting softly against the sensitive skin on the back of my neck. He provided immense, radiating warmth, occupying the exact space where there used to be nothing but freezing cold. The next morning, fully embracing the shift, he found me standing in the sunlit kitchen, still wrapped in the bulky, old flannel robe that he frequently insisted made me look perfectly cozy enough to just hug forever. Walking silently into the room, he came right up closely behind my back, immediately wrapped his long arms tightly around my relaxed shoulders, and affectionately rested his heavy chin directly on top of my head. "We're doing okay," he whispered softly into my hair, and listening to the absolute certainty in his voice, I deeply believed him. Without ever having a formal discussion about it, we had entirely stopped sleeping apart in separate rooms. It absolutely wasn't a conscious, planned decision that we sat down and made. It just naturally, inevitably happened, just like almost most of the incredible things that were unfolding in this new life. That evening, seeking simple entertainment, we sat down to play a casual game of cards in the center of the living room floor. An open, half-empty bottle of dark wine sat between us as the primary stakes. The background music played pleasantly low in the room. The conversation was light, and the laughter came easily to both of us. But at one specific point during the game, I reached my hand forward across the carpet to grab the deck of cards at the exact same time he did, and our bare hands violently collided and met over the deck. We both instantly froze in place, shocked by the sudden electricity. He slowly looked up, his eyes locking onto me. I looked right back at him, unable to break the intense, burning connection. And the heavy, loaded silence that immediately followed the touch wasn't awkward or uncomfortable in the slightest. It was incredibly full. It felt densely packed and entirely full of the weight of every single fleeting touch. Every lingering, heated glance, and every massive, unsaid thing that was rapidly building between us. Breaking the stillness, he leaned his face in toward me, agonizingly slow. He moved not with frantic, sloppy urgency, but with intense, deliberate. His warm lips softly brushed against my flushed cheek, and then boldly lingered dangerously near the edge of my jawline, sending shivers racing down my spine. Pulling back just an inch to look into my eyes, he promised, "I don't want to rush you," his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You are not," I immediately answered him breathlessly. And I meant it with every fiber of my being, because the undeniable magnetism drawing us together absolutely wasn't born out of desperate need or loneliness. It was purely about demanding presence. It was deeply about the intoxicating sensation of being truly, fully seen and desired. Maybe for the absolute first time in many, many long years of my life. That night, as we lay tangled together in the safety of the bed, I stared into the dark and whispered a confession into the room. "I don't know what this is supposed to be." Liam shifted his hand gently and thoughtfully, tracing the smooth knuckles of my fingers with his rough thumb. "Me neither," he honestly admitted back to me in the dark. "But I know it is real." A few rapid weeks later, life intervened when Liam suddenly received an unexpected, lucrative job offer. The important email notification popped up right on his phone screen. One quiet evening while we were peacefully sitting close together, watching the fireplace slowly burn down to low embers. He stared blankly at the glowing screen for a long time, his sharp features completely unreadable to me, before he finally turned his head to look at me. "It is in Asheville," he informed me, breaking the quiet. He explained the details, noting it was a good company, located in a charming small town right by the mountains. Processing the massive geographical distance, I nodded my head very slowly, feeling entirely unsure of exactly what I was supposed to feel about the news. "That is a really big move," I finally commented, trying to mask my He carefully studied every inch of my face, searching for my true reaction. "I won't go if you don't want me to," he offered without hesitation, prioritizing me over his career. I immediately forced a supportive smile onto my face. "You should absolutely go," I urged him selflessly. "You've essentially put your entire life on hold just for bypassing my attempt at noble detachment." He reached out directly across the space and grabbed my hand tightly. "What if I completely don't want to go anywhere without you?" he countered intensely. The heavy loaded words settled squarely in the space between us, acting just like a massive sudden open window letting in the fresh air. There was absolutely no suffocating pressure placed on me, and absolutely no strict expectation attached to the question. It was just presented as a beautiful possibility. It was an open door to a new life. We mutually agreed to give the monumental idea a solid week to steep in our minds. Needing to see the reality, we packed the car and drove out to Asheville together to explore. For the trip, we stayed together in a tiny rustic rental house that featured charmingly creaky old floors and boasted a breathtaking, expansive view of the dense green woods out back. We fell into an easy rhythm there, comfortably cooking dinner side by side in the cramped kitchen every night. During the days, we walked together along the quiet, winding mountain trails. In the evenings, we sat outside and read on the back porch, completely wrapped up together tight in one single shared blanket to fight off the mountain chill. Everything about being there with him felt incredibly natural and right. On the long car ride back to our old reality, neither of us felt the need to say very much out loud. But the silence filling the car was incredibly calm and reassuring. It felt exactly like we both firmly knew that we were completely no longer just standing nervously on the terrifying edge of something new, but rather we were completely standing right in the middle of it. When we finally arrived back home, absolutely everything about our old life suddenly looked sick. The massive house felt shrunken. The sprawling town felt suffocating. Even the heavy, haunting memories of the past felt reduced in their power over me. We dedicated our absolute last weekend in the house to sorting through the dusty attic for one final, conclusive time. We ruthlessly prioritized, carefully packing up only the things that truly mattered to us. We were finally actively letting go of absolutely everything else that didn't. Amidst the packing, I uncovered a gorgeous, delicate scarf that James had lovingly bought for me many years ago. It was woven from incredibly soft, bright blue wool. Overcome by a wave of gentle nostalgia, I wrapped the soft fabric tightly around my shoulders and stood quietly staring out from the doorway of the room. Seeing me pause, Liam walked up directly behind me, placing his large, warm hands securely on my upper arms. "You are allowed to miss him, you know," he whispered softly into my ear, offering me infinite grace. "I really do," I confessed honestly to him. "But the truth is, I just don't feel entirely lost in the world anymore." Hearing this, he gently turned my body around to fully face him, and we stood embracing exactly like that for a very, very long while. There was no dramatic background music playing, and absolutely no terrifying thunder crashing outside to force us together. It was just an era of quiet, absolute, profound understanding between two souls. That final night in the house, I sat silently on the edge of the large mattress and looked around our bedroom for one absolute last time. I didn't survey the room with any lingering, crushing sorrow, but instead, I was filled with a massive sense of total peace. Liam walked over, knelt down directly onto the floor right beside me, and affectionately rested his heavy head sideways on my bare knee. "Whatever this exact thing between us is," he said softly, looking up at me, "I realize I completely don't need anyone else in the world to understand it." He paused, his eyes shining. "I just need you," filled with overwhelming affection. I ran my trembling fingers through his soft, dark hair and smiled down at him. It was completely never about forcing people into understanding, I wisely told him. It was simply about surviving the darkest days of our lives. And then finally, choosing to actually live again. The very next morning, we worked together to load the absolute last heavy cardboard box into the trunk of the waiting car. The early sun was literally just beginning its ascent, painting the morning sky with brilliant light and casting vibrant shades of bright pink and dazzling gold directly across the asphalt of the driveway. Just before we finally pulled the car away, I turned my head and took one last, long look back at the old house. I stared at the sturdy wooden porch that James had built with his own two hands. I looked up at the specific upstairs window where a tiny young Liam used to sit quietly and draw pictures. When he was just a little boy, so many incredibly long years of our lives had been lived out, so many wildly different versions of myself had existed there. And now, I was driving towards something entirely, radically new. This bold new chapter wasn't meant to be a replacement for the past, nor was it a selfish rewrite of our family's history. It was simply a beautiful, unexpected continuation of the timeline. As the engine idled, Liam reached his arm out directly across the center console and grabbed my hand. "I am so incredibly glad we're actually doing this," he stated with absolute certainty. "Me too," I agreed instantly. We realized that we completely didn't need a detailed map to figure out our future. We just needed to get onto the open road. And more importantly, we just needed each other. As we slowly drove away, the familiar shape of the house quickly faded into the distance behind us, leaving only the vast open unknown stretching out endlessly ahead of us. The future wasn't terrifying to face, nor did it feel wrong in any way. It was just a completely unwritten story. Whatever harsh or confusing name the outside world might try to give to our relationship, honestly didn't matter to us at all anymore. Because this precious thing between us was entirely ours to protect. It was intensely quiet, wildly complicated, and yet perfectly, somehow entirely whole.